Welcome to the Mind of Business Success podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Kramer. Our guest today is Steve Haffner. Let's talk about some illusions today. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you, Alicia. It's great to be here.
So, tell us what you do. What is this illusion business that I'm referring to here?
Yes, and my tagline is unmask your solutions, unlock your solutions. And the reason I know a bit about illusions is because creating them was my job. So actually, I had a 30-year corporate career. I was in computer science. I was a programmer, systems engineer, got into management. I was a vice president. And then one day I just quit. I just quit, not just the job I was at, which I wasn't loving, but I quit my entire career to become a magician. Ta-da. So that's an interesting story in itself, but and of course there was risk involved, and it was a scary decision to make. But that's what I did, and I loved it. And I did kids shows and corporate shows, and it was great. But what I discovered was that, of course, magicians have to learn something about how the mind works in order for us to be able to know how to fool it, right? That makes sense. So I had to learn a little bit about psychology, and I discovered that, those same mental weaknesses and shortcuts and misperceptions that magicians have to understand so they can exploit and manipulate those. Well, those mental errors affect us in every other area of our thinking and decision making and problem solving that we do every day. Only difference is when it happens then, it's not quite so magical. So, I was doing entertainment only, and I loved it, and I was very happy doing it, but I wanted to do more because I wanted to share, what I was learning about how the mind works and how it can be fooled and how we're fooled all the time and we don't even realize it. And it does have adverse effects on our performance. So I wanted to share that. So I became a speaker, but I still do magic. I still have my passion for magic in my speaking programs, and I use it to illustrate some of the things that are happening in the audience's mind when they perceive a magic trick and a magician. So,
So, very, very intriguing stuff here. So, let's go into this because I'm sure you've identified some pretty common tripping points for people with respect to how the mind works. And I am notorious for saying when you understand how the mind works and you understand how the universe works, it takes a lot of the superstition out of things. But that's not something that is taught in school. We're not
right.
taught how the mind works. And I went to school for psychology, and there's a lot of knowledge as you're studying some of that conventional approach to understanding and reworking the human mind. But even that is largely lacking in a real depth of understanding in a way that the average person can apply in their own life. So I'm going to hand the mic back to you, and I would love your take on what you're seeing. What are some of those common stumbling points that you're helping people identify and work through?
Yes, gladly. Well, I was, as I was formulating what specifically am I going to talk about, and I've had several programs on different things, but one of the topics that kept coming back to me, or showing up when I would, do research, was the whole idea of trust and the value of trust and how our own minds subvert our ability to have and maintain and grow high trust relationships. The value of high trust relationships cannot be overstated. I mean, everybody knows trust is great, right? That it's important, but most people, we have the illusion that it's a soft, squishy thing. It's not measurable. Sure, it's nice, but actually it is measurable and quantifiable. Some people think building trust takes too long. It can happen very quickly. Restoring trust does take a while once it's been lost. But so we do have a lot of illusions when it comes to trust. As a magician, I have an audience that is primed not to trust me, right? You don't trust the magician to tell the truth and be honest and not to lie and cheat to get his way, right? But in that case, it's expected and even wanted, for mutual benefit. But magicians are not the only profession that has an audience that's primed to distrust them. In fact, every year there are Gallup polls and surveys on what are the most and least trusted professions, right? And you can probably guess some of the least trusted: politicians, car salesmen, lawyers, and that kind of thing. But I think, because I speak across industries, people, in all kinds of jobs, all kinds of industries. Um, and, trust is extremely important in every one of those industries. It doesn't matter what you do, the higher you can build your level of trust with your colleagues, with your clients, potential clients, with the public in general too. Because a lot of the industries I speak to, well, there is a misperceptions that the public have about their industry. For example, the plastic pipe industry. It's a great industry for the environment, but people think plastic bad for the environment. So there's people that, we have this lack of trust. So we have to think, and by the way, it's a natural illusion to mistrust. It's our fight or flight part of our brain that wants us to stay safe. And I'm great that we have this part of the brain, but it can also make us, overly suspicious, overly fearful, and it can hinder our ability to build, and grow high trust relationships. So I'll just give you an example of one thing that magicians do in order to build trust with their audience, and that can apply to other people as well, is something I call preemptive transparency. So in many of my programs, I do a trick with ropes, and I have somebody from the audience come up, and I say, I want you to look at these ropes. And I hand them the ropes and I say, take a look at them, make sure that they're normal and everything is copacetic. They're not tricked up or gimmicked or anything like that. And then they confirm. Okay. And then I can go on. Well, the reason is people are suspicious whenever a magician gets out a prop. And they're thinking, wonder what's going on with that thing, that box or that deck of cards or those ropes, for example. And so what I do now, they don't trust me. I could tell them till I'm blue in the face, these are normal ropes. The more I say it, the less they're going to believe me because I'm the magician. But I get somebody from the audience up, and that's one of them. That's somebody they can relate to and identify with. And when that person from the audience looks at the rope and provides the information to them to quell the suspicion about them being funky ropes, then they believe it. And then the effect has a bigger impact and it's more magical because they know the ropes weren't strange. They know it had to be, the magician skill to be able to do it. But I don't wait for the audience to shout out, we want to see the ropes, or those are trick ropes. I preemptively think about, okay, what's the audience going to be suspicious of or mistrusting of? And how can I provide the information to get rid of that uncertainty? Because suspicion only starts with uncertainty, and we don't like uncertainty. So how can I get rid of that uncertainty so that then they have the information they need to quell the mistrust and the suspicion? And so, other people can think about how can they do that as well. If they have somebody they're going to be talking to, a potential client, or maybe employees, and maybe employees are suspicious of a specific policy that you put into place. Well, tell them beforehand, be transparent about your decision-making process, about why you're doing it, why it'll be a benefit. People don't like being dictated to on high, because if they don't know why, negativity bias is going to creep in and they're going to have suspicion about, why is this going on? So,
well, this is a concept that is built into really good marketing as well. So we do that from social proof. We do that from testimonials. We do
exactly.
that if you're having a promotion, you have out a sales piece, marketing piece, and you're explaining why am I offering this discount? When you provide answers to those suspicions, those questions in the mind of your client, your customer, like you said, it's across the board. It could be your employees, it could be your colleagues, it could be your spouse for that matter.
Sure.
Why do you want to go to that conference, in the other the other country with all of those men. So when we are preemptive and we are addressing, this is why you said you use the word transparent. I love that. And I think that there is also an important component in this, that when we're authentic, because we can sort of sniff out the BS because of that tendency to mistrust. And so, if there's something incongruent, if there's glaringly obvious incongruencies, if the person that you pulled up from the audience was chatting with you 5 minutes before the show started, right? Well, now, not so effective, right?
Right. And that's funny that you bring that up because that's another point that I make during it. So I have a usually I do it with a mentalism routine, but I could do it with even with the rope trick and I say now, after the trick or even before I'll say to the person I say I know that they're out there thinking, hey, you're in on it. You collaborate, you had some conversation before, set this up, told him what to do, told him, hey, these are funky ropes, but tell everybody they're okay, and here's $20 to keep it to yourself. And then I say, did we do that? And they say, of course not. And then I offer $50,000 to anybody that can prove that I use any kind of pre-arrangement or audience stooge or anything like that. And that's effective because I make myself vulnerable. $50,000 is a lot of money for one, but people will think, okay, he wouldn't make that promise if he was doing something, you know, behind the scenes like that. And that's something else, that trust takes vulnerability. It's if you, a key, one of the strategies that I recommend is if you have someone that maybe you don't trust a whole lot, extend a little bit of trust to them. You don't have to, take a huge risk and bet your business on it, but extend trust. They can see that you're extending trust and you're making yourself vulnerable because risk is inherently part of trust. So they see that and they are much more likely to respond by being trustworthy and by trusting you more. And it just builds, the trust builds on that. So yeah, trust by proxy. That's a big thing. You talked about testimonials, and that's basically what I'm doing with the person on stage. I call it trust by proxy. Ideally, I'd give the ropes to everybody in the audience to take a look at, right? But not practical. But this person stands as a proxy for the rest of the audience, and they have the information and they give it to the audience and it works for them. So
You mentioned also that tendency to be either overly trusting or overly skeptical. And neither of those are an empowering place to be operating from. And I talk a lot about the law of vibration, and there's this scale, right? And so in the middle is our alignment. That's when we're trusting to the right people, right? We might be practicing reasonable caution, but we're not overly trusting and we're not necessarily overly skeptical. It's sort of in that sweet spot where we're now making empowered decisions and we're operating in a way that is beneficial for ourselves as well as for others. There's this tendency when someone has a fear, like I can't trust, that the mind is very, very black and white. And so the mind thinks, well, if I am not overly skeptical, then I'm going to do something stupid and I'm going to go completely on the opposite. And I'm going to become overly trusting of really bad people that have all of these malicious intentions. But what we know is, and I like to use an example. So, just like somebody who has an irrational fear, like an irrational fear of heights, when you are able to remove that overly active fear, that irrational fear, we don't become irrational in the opposite, where now we're walking off of 10-story buildings, because we are now actually in our more neutral state where we're functioning in a healthier way. And the mind doesn't go from irrational on one side of the spectrum to irrational on the other side of the spectrum if we're properly cleaning up that sort of irrational programming.
Mm-hmm.
You can see I don't step off of a tall building, right? You know that there are logical, rational ways of not being overly fearful. So for someone who is a self-diagnosed mistrusting person,
Mm-hmm.
how would you what advice would you give to that person? Because we know that this is a common thing. There are a lot of people who are self-proclaimed, I don't trust anyone.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two things. Self-awareness, first of all, you know, understanding and admitting to yourself, look, I'm not a very trusting person. And it's not serving me well to be this mistrusting. And you're right, there is a sweet spot. Um, but one of the things, which I mentioned was extending trust to people. So if you have to, I call it confront the lizard. I talked about the lizard brain. I know it's not a specific brain part, but the primitive functionality, fight or flight functionality. Um, it, we have that, that part of our brain that is, it's all about safety and security. And we have to we have to recognize what it's doing and say, okay, wait a minute. I've got this person. I'm not trusting them very much. Is this based on actual founded information, something that they've actually done? Or do I not trust them because of the company they're with, organization they belong to, identity traits or whatever? What's making me have this level of mistrust? And then you try to overcome that, whatever that mistrusting bias is that you have, by using your rational brain to say, hey, this doesn't make sense that I'm not trusting this person. Let me extend some trust to him and see what happens. And even if someone has broken your trust in the past, uh, it is worth it to try to build that trust back up. Sometimes we say, well, I'm not trusting that person, unless they make up for it in some way. Well, if you take the initiative and say, hey, let's try this again, or I want to trust you with this, and they see you trusting them, that's a good step in the right direction. And again, yes, going too far is not a good idea either. There was a study of some economists to see if there was a correlation between trust and income. And they asked people a question on a scale of 0 to 10. Do you think most people can't be trusted, or that most people can be trusted? Basically, that's what it asks. You can't be too careful, or most people can be trusted. And the higher up on the trust level that you rated yourself, the higher your income was, overall, according to the study, up to a 9. But then at 10, it dropped off. So if you're trust everybody and don't use any kind of, discernment or qualification, well, you might want to rethink that a little bit. But otherwise, most of us could stand to be a little more trusting, because trust, a big problem right now with a lot of organizations, and especially with your audience, I think right now, of course, is staffing and employee retention, right? Well, the number one, it was shown there was like, I think 700 HR professionals that were surveyed and asked what the most important leadership trait is for engaging employees. Of course, engaging means retaining. That's a big part of retaining employees, keeping them engaged. The number one leadership trait was trust. So, again, I think it's so valuable, and it's very underestimated, undervalued, as a trait that we need.
That's powerful. So you just gave a couple of really, really, really good references here to support the value in trusting in a healthy way. So for our entrepreneurs listening, right? Most of us are always reaching for increasing profitability, growing our businesses. So here now, that study is fascinating. I'd never heard that before. I absolutely love it. And I am going to be referencing that because
Awesome.
it is fantastic.
Yeah.
So the correlation between a high level of trust, not an over the top level of trust, but a high level of trust to higher income. And it's very practical when we think about it as business owners. If anyone has experience with hiring employees, managing employees, we know that when you're not trusting, it does have an adverse effect on that relationship and that employee's performance. And that was another thing that you had cited, was that correlation between employee satisfaction and probably productivity and
Right.
retention when they feel trusted. Because if any of us are being self-honest, we will admit it does not feel good when someone doesn't trust us,
Exactly.
whether
Yep.
it's valid or not. And in many cases, it's not. It
Right.
is a bias.
Hmm.
And so to be able to let go of those biases, be objective and challenging why you have that mistrust, and getting yourself to a place where you can begin to reestablish trust in your employees, it has a positive ripple effect in your business.
Yeah. And I would like to recommend this based on my experience in the corporate world is take a look at your policies and procedures. And are there any that kind of have the aroma of mistrust to them? You know, for example, there was one company I was with, we had to sign a promissory note where, we went through training. If we left the company within 3 years, we had to pay back, like $10,000, a lot of money back in the 80s, especially. And, I could understand the reason for the policy, but it felt like they didn't trust us. Right. Had another company with a almost draconian non-disclosure, non-compete agreement that they wanted us to sign. They bought our company and wanted us to sign, and it was unenforceable because it was so restrictive. Right. I left the company not long after that. I didn't feel this level of trust at all. I felt like, okay, they're basically trying to, well, I won't go into the details of it, but I think the culture comes from the top, and you have to be careful. I understand protecting, but do you have policies that tell your employees you don't trust them very much? How how strict are your monitoring policies, especially with work from home? And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying, just be careful that people aren't thinking, man, they don't trust us. I'm going to go somewhere where I do feel trusted.
So we probably could continue on this topic because I know it's a deep one. This
Mhm.
is going back to the beginning of our conversation, right? This is one of those tripping points that you identified that a lot of people have. And I can speak from experience working with business owners for over a decade. This is common. Mistrust issues are super, super, super common. And even just in our day-to-day lives, we see this, right? So with your children, with your spouse, with your family members, just in general. You mentioned politicians, and you would probably throw in doctors and all sorts of things, right?
Right.
But the fact is it is something that is affecting all of us, and there probably is room for improvement for all of us. But since we don't have more time, I want to make sure that our listeners know how they can connect with you. So, can you share with us your website and anywhere else you would like to direct them to?
Yes, absolutely. My website is stevehaffner.com, and it's SteveHaffner. And that's where you can get, videos and information. And you can also sign up for my newsletter. I have a weekly email newsletter. It's very brief, just a few minute read. And I have links to interesting topics related to performance, illusions, critical thinking, decision making, problem solving, all the good, fun, delicious brainy kind of stuff. So it's a fun newsletter. Send it out every week. I connect it to my blog when I do new blog posts, but that's on my website as well. I hang out on LinkedIn, so you could just do a search for Steve Haffner. I'll pop right up. And that's mainly where I am. I'm on Twitter too, but primarily LinkedIn and my website.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for being with us today. It has been a fun conversation.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And of course, thank you to all of our listeners. You know, we're doing this for you. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure you do so. And until next time, we will see you in the next episode.